the conversation over just how much foreign aid the UK should give away continues, with a growing Conservative rebellion galvanised in particular by cuts to aid in Yemen, which is facing a humanitarian crisis. The UK government is potentially facing a legal challenge by members of its own party after Foreign Office Minister James Cleverly suggested that the government may forge ahead and sign the change into law without a vote in Parliament. In 1970, the UK pledged to spend 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid as part of a UN pact. In 2015, that pact was enshrined in law. But back in November, Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced that foreign aid would be cut to 0.5% of GDP in order to balance the books during the COVID pandemic. Earlier this month, over 200 charities wrote to the government criticising the decision to cut. Their letter was followed by the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres calling the subsequent proposal to reduce financial support for Yemen by 67% as a death sentence. But anyone who watched the budget last week will know the incredible strain the UK economy is under. Are we giving more than we can afford? Is foreign aid a handout or an investment? Andrew Mitchell is Conservative MP for Sutton Coldfield and former International Development Secretary. Samuel Armstrong is Director of Communications for the Henry Jackson Society, and Lingarini Mihawa is Country Director for Oxfam in Malawi. Andrew, if I could start with you, let's tackle that first point. You support this legal challenge against the government if they attempt to bring this into force without a vote in Parliament. Is that right?
Well, we need a vote so that the position is clear. The law of the land, as you have just set out, is that we are a generous nation. We promised the poorest in the world that we would allocate 0.7% of our gross national income to the poorest in the world. And it's not just a promise to the poor, it was also a manifesto commitment signed up to by every single member of the House of Commons elected just over a year ago. So we need a vote because the law of the land is that we spend that 0.7, and we live in a democracy. If you want to change that, you can't change it by the pen of the executive. You need to change the law, and the law is very clear. Now, the government doesn't at the moment feel that it wants to have a vote. I suspect that's something to do with the number of members of Parliament and colleagues of mine who've expressed very deep reservations about breaking this promise. And if we can't get a vote, then I think we need to use the legal system just to confirm to the government and to everyone else that you have to abide by the law in Britain, even if you are the government.
It is a difficult time, though, Andrew, isn't it? And we're in a situation where we definitely need to begin to tighten our belts and repay the money that this pandemic has cost us. Why not start with the foreign aid budget and instead focus on British citizens?
Well, that is a very good point, but there is a clear answer. No one wants to see us prioritising spending money overseas over and above our own constituents. And we've seen this debate, for example, over vaccinations. I argue that Britain should be generous in its support for vaccinating the poorest in the world, because we'll never defeat COVID here until we defeat it everywhere. But the fact remains that we must look after our own constituents first, and I completely agree with that. Now, as you also say, we need to recognise the state of the public finances. But the point about the 0.7 is it does directly do that, because it is 0.7 of our gross national income. And over the last year, our gross national income has gone down a very great deal. So the spending would go down anyway by £2.9 billion. And although it's a great deal of money, we obviously accept that the poorest have to take that hit because of the state of the British economy and the way the 0.7 law is designed. But on top of that, if the government were successful in reducing the 0.7 to 0.5, that would take another £4 billion out. And that's nearly £7 billion out of a £15 billion programme. That is half the money. And you cannot take half the money out of Britain's foreign direct development assistance without meaning that there will be hundreds of thousands of avoidable deaths, largely amongst children and young people.
Samuel, you've heard Andrew speak there. I think you believe that the foreign aid budget needs a trim. But do you concur with some of his points?
I agree with Andrew that British aid plays an important part in saving lives, and it's demonstrated a good deal of success in that. But as Andrew wrote when he first introduced the 0.7 commitment to the UK policy back in 2010, aid has another purpose, that's to ensure Britain's security. And back then that made sense. The biggest threats to us were from failed states in the likes of Africa and the Middle East that in turn turned to terrorism and endangered our security. What's happened over the past few years, though, is that the threat situation has actually grown worse. We now face a resurgent China and Russia, all of whom threaten to completely overwhelm our sort of values if left unchecked. So the UK now has to change with the changing threats, its spending. And the 4 billion that we've cut to aid has gone almost exactly to the penny into the defence budget. So none of this money has disappeared from our overseas spending. It's just been shifted from one pot to the other. And I think with China on the rise, with Russia increasingly assertive abroad, many of your listeners will recognise that with that changing threat circumstance, it's only right that we move that aid spending.
Andrew, is aid all about defence in the end?
It's certainly about tackling conflict and turmoil, which, although often far away, can rebound directly on the streets of London. But the point that's just been made is not, in my judgment, correct. You know, if you withdraw aid from Somalia, you help Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization, rebuild itself in that jurisdiction. If you withdraw the aid that is spent on security, building security in northern Nigeria, you help Boko Haram, the terrorist organization there. And across that whole belt of insecurity in North Africa, not far from Europe, but very dangerous for us, the terrorist recruiter draws strength when people understand the extent of their poverty and lack of opportunity in life. And British development money does a huge amount to try and tackle these colossal discrepancies of opportunity and wealth, which disfigure our world. So if you withdraw it in the way that is being suggested, it will have a terrible effect on our own security and prosperity, as well as those in the countries we're trying to help. And remember that it was Defense Secretary Mattis, Donald Trump's Defense Secretary, who warned the president, and I quote, that every time you cut aid, I have to order more ammunition.
Samuel, we're already cutting aid, as Andrew pointed out, by the fact that our GDP has decreased and it's gone down by £2.9 billion. And the charities letter follows one, the charities letter that I mentioned in the introduction, follows one by business groups, including the CBI and the International Chambers of Commerce, who've also criticised the move. Don't we risk giving up soft power, now that we're an island nation on our own, by reducing the foreign aid budget, which is very much what it's used for in many ways, isn't it?
And I think it would be the case if the UK had dropped down in the list. Instead, the UK has gone from the joint top spender alongside Germany to second in the list. We're now behind only Germany in how much we spend on our aid, maintaining that level at 0.5% of our gross national income. And it's worth saying, of course, that Germany doesn't meet in the same way that we do its NATO commitment to spend 2% of its earnings on defence. So taken in the round, the UK is going far beyond paying its fair share in terms of its international commitment. And we have to recognise that actually, one of the things our international allies continually rely on us for is our commitment to our security missions. So, Andrew brought up Somalia. We played an important role in preventing piracy off the Somalian coast. We're going to play an important role in defending freedom of navigation in the South China Sea come the end of the year. All of these things cost money too. And if we want to fund our national defence, then we've got to find the money from somewhere. And when the UK is, as it's currently doing, running record levels of deficits, then moving money around from one pot to the other as the security profile, the threat profile that we face changes, is a very sensible decision that should really be open to a democratically elected government to make decisions as it finds them.
Indeed, though I suppose they also have to be held to promises made in the past. But let's just look a little bit at the impact of the cuts. Lingurini, you're well placed to tell us what this money means in the places where it arrives. What sort of schemes is foreign aid spent on where you are in Malawi?
Thank you so much. So, speaking from a country like Malawi, any cuts in the aid development assistance that the British government gives would really be a default on its promises to the poor people, and it defeats the vision that the British government has been putting around global Britain. In Malawi, the UK government is supporting very critical sectors like the health sector. Actually, at least 44% of our health budget is being supported by the UK government, and it goes a long way in supporting young people to be able to access sexual and reproductive health rights. It supports children to get vaccination. It supports women to be able to survive from maternal morbidity and mortality. So the kind of cuts that any government, and in particular the UK government that has played its leadership in terms of its pledge for the 0.7 target of national income towards development assistance would be regrettable. The funding here supports a critical sector like education, where we know that in a country like Malawi, if we have to move from a low income country to a middle income country, human capital development is important. And we know that if we can't get our young people into school, it means that Malawi will be in a cycle of poverty. So the UK government supports a lot of programs, credible programs on education. It supports a lot of programs on key sectors like the humanitarian assistance. And for me, I recall that when Cyclone Idai hit Malawi in 2019, the DFID office here in Malawi was one of the first responders to support the government and the poor communities that were affected by that Cyclone Idai in terms of critical support for their recovery of livelihoods, but also just the long-term resilience. And of course, given the situation now, I have seen the leadership that the UK government has played in Malawi in terms of supporting us with COVID-19 response. As I speak now, I certainly know that the UK government has been able to provide not less than £15 million to Malawi to support strengthening health systems and, of course, also helping the poor people that have been affected because of the shocks that COVID-19 has brought to their livelihoods. And I certainly know that the UK government will be very critical in terms of supporting the government of Malawi in its rollout of the COVAX vaccine that has come in the country, and it's due to start next week, Monday, on the 15th. So if there is any cut in the budget that supports countries like Malawi, there's going to be a lot of negative consequences, some of which will be deaths of poor people that can't access health services. It will be years and years of non-reversal of the impacts of illiteracy because young people can't go to school. It will be deaths associated with our weak response to humanitarian catastrophes because there will be a huge withdrawal of funding that we receive from the UK government. So in my view, this is not the good time for British government to make its defaulting on its promises. We think that it will undermine its moral authority. But also, let's remember that there are other countries that are in a more precarious situation like than Malawi. We're talking about conflict-affected countries like Yemen, like South Sudan, like Somalia. These are fragile states that need the support that the world can give. And we look at Britain as one of the key leaders that should be able to support such countries from the raging hands of poverty and inequality.
Indeed. And Samuel, isn't it true that in many ways foreign aid is an investment rather than a handout? And what we should be thinking of doing perhaps is not about the amount of money, but just where it goes.
I certainly agree that it is an investment, and I'm not an aid skeptic. I think aid works, but it's one of dozens of different things that works. we could fund the UK's aid budget into Yemen tomorrow, and it would still be the case that hundreds of Yemenis within the next month are going to get killed in conflict. Aid can't stop war.
No, but it can help prevent hunger, can't it?
And it's something that works. But
sorry, Samuel, we're having really bad problems with your line. I'm going to just go to Andrew and then come back to you in a moment when we try and sort it out, because you keep dropping out, so we're missing all your pearls of wisdom. Andrew, if I could just turn to you for a moment and say, by cutting the foreign aid budget, do you agree with the UN Secretary General that we're signing a death sentence for those countries in receipt of aid? He was talking specifically about Yemen, which Samuel mentioned there.
Yes, I do. And I think that it's absolutely beyond doubt that the effect of this cut will be that we lose literally hundreds of thousands of people. We will have hundreds of thousands of avoidable deaths, principally among children. Can I just pick up a point that Samuel made about the G7? He said we're still second in the G7. And it is true, but we have been development leaders. We've been regarded as the people who produce the ideas, not just the money, but the ideas and the mechanisms in a globalized world which really tackle these extremes of poverty. And at just the point when we are chairing the group of G7 nations, when we are trying to show the world what global Britain looks like post-Brexit, we become the only member of the G7 who is cutting its support for the poorest. Germany, as Samuel mentioned, has hit the 0.7. America is going to boost its development spending by $15 billion. The French have announced that they too now will try and hit the 0.7 and have set a timescale for that. We are the only cutter, and it is the biggest cut in development spending ever. And it looks suspiciously as though we are balancing our books in what is a wealthy country on the backs of the world's poorest, while surrendering our international leadership at just the point when we're trying to show people what global Britain means.
Samuel, if you'd like to respond to that. I mean, the point of 0.7% is that it goes up and down, doesn't it, depending on our GDP? Shouldn't that be the way in which it's rationalised?
Yes, but 0.7 isn't a level fixed each year on the basis of how much poverty or otherwise there is. Otherwise,
that's the point, isn't it? It's 0.7% of our GDP. So if we're poorer, we give less money.
But that's right. But then, accordingly, then we should revisit 0.7 on the basis of how much poverty there exists in the world. It doesn't do that. It's ultimately a target that is, while semi-justified, it is arbitrary. It's set each year, and it's set to roll over. And my point is, as threats change, things need to move around as well. And what we must also remember is that foreign aid that we talk about that meets this 0.7% is not the only form of aid. So, for example, much of our spending on the BBC World Service, which promotes democracy, which promotes openness around the world, doesn't count as what they call official development assistance, ODA, which is what aid needs to qualify as in order to count towards that 0.7%. And there are an awful lot of things that we could and should fund that sit outside of what would count towards that 0.7%.
Well, we do fund the BBC, don't we? We do fund the BBC, and you say that the 0.7% is set every year, but it's actually not set every year. It's enshrined in law, isn't it?
Well, it's enshrined in law that the Development Secretary, or as it now is, the Foreign Secretary, would have to come and give a statement to the House should we dip below that. And indeed, I believe the government's position is that they have satisfied that legal test.
Andrew?
Well, and on the BBC World Service, Samuel is absolutely right. It's a superb example of value for money and in this spending. And when I was the Development Secretary, I increased the funding to the BBC World Service Trust by 9 times. So I grant him that he's absolutely right on that point.
You've scored the point, Andrew. Now let's go on back to the discussion.
I think he was making the point about the 0.7 being an arbitrary figure, and it is an arbitrary figure. But you have to settle on something, and it's the promise we made after the Brandt report back in 1970, when all wealthy countries, all the more wealthy developed countries, made this promise. And it's important to stick to it, because if you start messing around with it, you can always argue that it could be 0.9 or 0.5, and I always used to say that I thought I could spend in the British taxpayers' interest double the 0.7 if I had the opportunity. But it is the 0.7 we fixed on, and we should stay with that. And also, I think the government won't survive a court hearing if they mount Samuel's eloquent argument that there's a provision in the bill which says the minister has to come to Parliament and explain. Because the point about that is if the government intends to hit the 0.7 but doesn't, it must then explain why and how it missed it. But what we're looking at here is premeditation. You can't advance into a new tax year in April and say, when you've got the law of the land talking about 0.7, you can't say, well, we're going to miss it deliberately and expect that that will coincide with the law, because it won't.
Let me bring Lingarini back in. Lingarini, we're talking about Britain as a global state, and we're now an island nation on our own. I wonder if the aid to Malawi is reduced, and of course Malawi is just one example. How does that alter Britain's status in the eyes of your country?
Well, to begin with, Britain has really been a generous supporter for Malawi's democracy, for Malawi's long-term vision. So if there is any cuts, as has been widely put in the public domain, it will actually be regrettable. I think we look up upon Britain to be a leader that can actually herald the other countries to be able to support low-income countries like Malawi. So this is going to really batter some image, because we do expect that Britain should be the first to respect its word. And as I indicated, that when they made that promise with the poor around that pledge for the 0.7% of the income, we really saw that solidarity. And I do remember Andrew Mitchell, when he visited Malawi around about 2012, when I was working in government with the president's office. I mean, we all looked up to the commitments that the UK government had made to Malawi, and immediately we saw the impact that was there to resuscitate the economy through the support to the economic recovery program that the president then had put. So any mention of a cut to the support that Malawi and other countries in our similar situation would actually be a point of regret, and I really dare say that the compact that Britain signed, more or less loosely speaking, with the poor, is something else that we expect them to respect. So it will not be looked at in good light, I must say.
Samuel, what would you say to nations like Malawi, where we'll be reneging on promises?
Well, I think, look, firstly, we're not talking about cancelling existing grant programs. These are changes in future year commitments that we make. But the second thing is, and I think this is a really interesting point, is that actually the level of influence that we as the UK have in African countries to which we commit an awful lot of aid is comparably less to what China is enjoying for far less aid and support commitments that it does through its Belt and Road Initiative, in which it, rather than funding things that are directly supporting the well-being of children and the vulnerable, it's building big roads, it's building big ports. And then accordingly, you see in UN votes that time and time again, African countries, particularly on the east coast of Africa, where Chinese aid is principally directed, are voting again and again with China, and they're doing so against the UK. So I think there is an important point here in how we deliver influence around the world, that you've got to question after a certain period of time, is aid delivering for that influence as much as other forms of support to Africa that wouldn't count towards the 0.7?
Well, I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but thank you all so very much for joining me today. Thank you to Samuel Armstrong from the Henry Jackson Society, to former International Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell, and to Oxfam's Country Director in Malawi, Lingarini Mihawa. In the next hour, I'll be joined by Scotland's national poet, Jackie Kay, and remembering the musical legacy of Bunny Wailer.